Their bodies collided, and Jacob's flash of anxiety briefly overwhelmed his fear of shells and landmines. The stubborn silence continued as he drove ever higher, cocooned by the shared sense of danger and by the metal but vulnerable shell of the jeep. They stared at the road, ears turned to the rumbling of guns as they skirted the northernmost edge of the American lines. So far the artillery exchanges had sounded muted, but suddenly hostile mortar shells exploded all around them. A sorcerer had surely conjured up these sharp whistles, these growing thuds. Shells came over ever closer. When one, thank God, a dud landed just yards away, he knew that when spotted, they must have crossed the fluid, almost invisible border between enemies. "Get out!" His voice cracked. She'd understood him, but he screamed once more in German, "Raus!" In a blur of movement, they scrambled from the jeep. Yes, the partisans still clutched her with battered briefcase. They ran for cover among snow-draped pines, and heavy underbrush. They cowered in sudden terror at a sharp whistle, an ear-splitting explosion. Behind them, the jeep burst into flames. They stood transfixed, mouths agape, aware of the hairbreadth escape, then dropped to the ground for cover. "Danke," she muttered in the enemy's language. For a brief moment, the guns were silent. Then, abruptly, a hideous mechanical scream sliced the air. A mere 100 yards away, a thunderous crash flared into blinding light. The earth shuddered. Their bodies shut up. In a frantic embrace, they clutched at each other, falling to earth, bands gripping rough cloth, warmed by pulsing life underneath. Jacob found himself looking down into dark eyes, wild with terror and the fear of death. It had lasted only a moment. Now they lay still. The forest lay quiet around them. The safe house was now out of reach. They must spend the freezing night in the underbrush, pinned down by enemy fire. They dared not stir. They remained tense and alert for enemy patrols, for soldiers crushing through the underbrush, searching, seeking, groping for them. Each slight rustle in the woods, the wind, a nocturnal animal, brought their guard up, eyes and ears straining in the dark. Fearful, they huddled in their nests of pine needles amid patches of icy snow under the looming pines and tangled shrubs. The enemy commander must have decided they died in the jeep or in the final round for fire, but nobody came to hunt them. Okay, that's then of course eventually they get to that safe house and they get their business done and they separated. But after a while, it took several months, weeks first, and then months for him to track her down, and they got together after he got back to the States, and eventually she came over as his wife. And they both taught at the University of Washington. He in history and she naturally in Italian. And but she had a past, but not what everyone thought it was. She was not really a communist at the time, but what she was when she was a young student. But all of that, she was in danger when the McCarthy-like committee, the Canwell Committee, was in town. And this is the briefer passage that I would like to read to you. So, excuse me, I lost my space here somehow. Oh, yeah, no, I didn't. Here it is. He, that is Jacob, is now, this takes place in an armory in downtown Seattle. And it's a large auditorium where, not a small interview, where this takes place. And he is just walking in. He, Jacob, had never felt more exposed. Sitting slantwise before the dais, he swept the crowded chamber with a glance, while the chairman's gavel continued to pound the table. He half listened to the droning exhortations about the importance of giving clear answers loud enough so that they could be heard by the recording system. He scanned the still faces, eyes he knew and eyes he did not, eyes he loved and eyes he feared and hated. He fervently hoped that his father hadn't come, yet his friends were out there in force. Katya sat with Elmo. There was his Francesca, unmoving, flanked by Greta and by Mike, still stiff and erect. And yes, there, sitting apart from them all, he saw the impassive face of Dr. Otto Becker, the man he had begged not to come. Adversaries were also in evidence. Glenn Arnold, the angry student at Garrett's lecture, banded together with several companions in a conspicuous enclave, glaring and hostile. Newsmen hustled about everywhere with their notebooks and cameras, shooting pictures with blinding flashbulbs, seemingly at random. When the gavel ceased its imperious hammering, Jacob straightened to face his interrogators. The routine began. Canwell administered the oath. Sitting with his back to the audience, Jacob felt hemmed in. A drop of sweat trickled into his left eyebrow, but he didn't reach for his handkerchief, feeling the eyes he loved and those he feared focused on him, burning the nape of his neck. Pratt peered down at him, his slicked down hair glistening in the electric light. Lieutenant Becker, are you now, or have you ever been, a member of the Communist Party? Jacob had his answer ready, the same answer he'd heard several times a day, all week long. I'm prepared to answer to your question, for myself only. The answer is no on both counts. Pratt's thin lips widened in an ironic smile. Then he went on as if Jacob had not spoken. You were an intelligence officer with the United States Army in Italy during the war, were you not? Yes, sir. His voice was expressionless. I understand you came originally from Germany, a refugee. Pratt paused, peering over his glasses, giving himself an air of gravity. Yes, of course you fought well for this country. He paused again, no doubt for dramatic effect. So perhaps you can tell us how Nazi oppression differs from communist oppression. They're both oppressive. But you do consort with known communists. Jacob remained silent. Or at least with people who lie about their communist past. The words came over him like a flood, suffocating, drowning. Behind him existed only the eyes he loved, unseen, burning. The chief investigator did not let him say more. His bland face was now contorted. Jacob feared the man's anger, which to his horror made him cringe. He became desperate to escape. Pratt spoke with stinging sarcasm. You live with a woman who hid her communist past? You so testify to our associate? You live with a woman, your very own wife, who covered up her communist connections? She is known as a person who defamed with a poisoned pen a celebrated German painter. Your wife, a woman who has perjured herself on 2 occasions. Your wife, your very own wife, you admitted it. You said so yourself, didn't you, sir? Didn't you, Lieutenant? Didn't you so state to our associate, Mr. Gerald Doherty, this very afternoon? Didn't you? Jacob Becker was silent. He heard a gasp, a muffled outcry. Canwell intervened. I remind you that you are under oath and required by law to answer our questions, all of them. In a regular court of law, Jacob knew he could not be pressured to implicate his wife, but this was a hearing, not a court of law, and such rules were more laxly applied. He saw no exit, no escape from the chairman's towering anger, his knuckles tightening around his gavel, his lips compressed, his face flushed. With an angry edge to his voice, he repeated the charge. Your testimony